So thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. I feel slightly qualified because I have tinnitus. I'm a drummer for many years. So not only do I have tinnitus, but I hear nothing above 12,000 hertz, which is a little bit poor for somebody of my age. My father also suffered from being very hard of hearing towards the end of his life. So I'm familiar with the family issues which are caused by hard of hearing. I'm going to cover a lot of ground in the next few minutes, and so what I'd like to do is give you a quick map of what I'm going to talk about. Firstly, I'm going to suggest to you that sound affects all human beings profoundly. This comes as something of a revelation to most of the audiences that I speak to. Probably to you, that's no surprise at all. Secondly, that most people in the world are unconscious about sound. Although it affects us very profoundly, most people are not conscious of those effects. And as a result of that, the world has become noisier and noisier because of this unconsciousness. The cost of that noise is enormous, absolutely enormous, and I'm going to speak a little bit about that. So the antidote to that is that we need to start listening. Again, something which you are going to be far better at than most. In fact, most groups who consider themselves disadvantaged by a handicap would see themselves as behind other people. You are ahead. You are the leaders. You are sensitive to sound in a way that most people are not. And I really am excited to be here because the HRF campaign to talk about the sound environment is a way in which you are leading the way and championing a cause on behalf of everybody else who hears perfectly well and is being affected by all the things you feel and they don't notice. So it's fantastic to be here. I'm going to start then by talking about the ways in which sound affects human beings. There are 4 ways sound affects us all. No, you can leave that up. Don't turn it down, please. That was fairly gentle, actually, because I know you're sensitive to sound. I didn't want to upset anybody too much. That's a little shot of cortisol. That kind of sound, a sudden sound, causes a release of your fight-flight hormones, cortisol, noradrenaline. And I could play another sound, in fact I will, surf, which will calm you down. A sound which has a frequency of around 12 beats per minute and emulates the feeling of the breathing of a sleeping human being. Also a sound we associate with being relaxed and on holiday and having no cares, so it's a relaxing sound. Sound is affecting us all physiologically all the time. It affects our heart rate, our breathing, our hormone secretions, and even our brain waves. So physiologically, the first way sound affects us. The second way is psychologically. This piece of music is not going to make you feel happy. It wasn't designed to make you feel happy. And music is very good at conveying emotion. It affects the way we feel. Music is not the only sound that does that, however. Birdsong, for example, is a sound which leads many people to feel secure, because we have learned over hundreds of thousands of years that when the birds are singing, we're safe. It's only when the birds stop singing that we need to be worried. That means there's a predator around, and it's a threatening sound, sudden cessation of birdsong. The third way sound affects us is cognitively. You can't understand 2 people talking at the same time, or in this case, one person talking twice. We have a very small amount of cognitive bandwidth for audio. And that means if you're in an office and there's somebody talking on the other side of the desk and you're trying to think, they're taking up that very small bit of space where you're trying to process ideas and symbols. And the effect on productivity of working in an office that sounds like this, an open plan office, for example, is devastating. Two-thirds of the productivity of somebody who's trying to manipulate symbols in their brain that way is lost in that kind of noise. Open plan offices are great for certain things, but if we're going to have open plan, we also need to have quiet working space. We need to start to design according to what people are trying to do and not get carried away with one particular benefit. I know now there are moves towards, for example, open plan schools, This has got major implications, and we need to be very, very careful about implementing that kind of design without thinking of the sound effects and the ways that that's going to change people's ability to listen and concentrate. The final way sound affects us is behaviorally. At the most simple, we tend to move away from unpleasant sound. So if I were to play this for more than a few seconds, many of you would start to feel uncomfortable. If I left it on for 10 minutes, you'd probably be leaving the room. For people who can't get away from noise like that, it creates enormous health problems, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit more in a moment. And where we work a lot with organizations is to show them that making unconscious noise like that, or we're going to have a look at retail, for example, has a devastating effect on their performance. Here's a number which would frighten most retailers. They're losing a huge amount of sales because of the bad sound they're creating in their shops, which causes all of us, and especially you, and probably me, because I listen very much, to leave. Maybe just a bit sooner than we would, but in retail, they know that dwell time, the amount of time you spend in a shop, is directly related to sales. If we leave sooner, we spend less, and that's not sensible for them. I'll just give you a few examples of the things that we all have to put up with in retail environments. This is trays being stacked and dropped on the floor in a supermarket. And if you're not looking, that's a very unpleasant sound to have next to you. I don't have to introduce this one particularly. It's an old friend in most supermarkets, the squeaky trolley. Nobody is listening to that. Nobody cares. Nobody takes it out of service. It just goes on wailing until it dies. Chiller cabinets. This is 75 decibels of chiller cabinet at 1 meter. Stand between two of these and you feel like you're being beaten up. Music. I don't have to tell you about the evils of mindless music in retail situations. I mean, who thinks this is a nice sound to shop to? It really did sound that bad. Tiny little ceiling speakers, doors open, allowing road noise into shops, terrible acoustics, reverberating the sound around inside of a shop, and then public address systems over the top of it. Retail sound is very, very unpleasant in many cases. Now, what's happened because of all this noise is that most people have gone unconscious. We've become so used to suppressing the sound around us that we don't notice it. We stand on street corners bellowing over huge amounts of noise and pretend that's normal. If we could see this, or if we could smell it, we wouldn't put up with it. And yet, because it's sound, we just play this game of the emperor's new clothes and we all pretend it's not there. Now, that means that we've lost a really important skill that we used to have. And that skill is listening. Listening is absolutely fundamental. In communication, most people spend around 60% of their time listening. If you talk to any great salesperson, they'll tell you that listening is far more important than speaking in a sales conversation. And yet we're not very good at listening. Average listening comprehension is just 25%, which means we only hear 1 word in 4 on average of what's being said to us. Now, not you, not this talk, but on average, that's true for most people. That's pretty serious. We're not very good at listening. I wonder if you've ever considered what the definition of listening is. Sounds like a silly question, but it isn't. I have a definition to offer you. Making meaning from sound. And it's a process, it's a significant process, which you're probably very much more aware of than most people. It's a process with 3 parts. The first 2 parts are kind of physical. There's the physicality of sound touching us. Now, we hear with our whole body, of course. The famous percussionist, Dame Evelyn Glennie, has ears that don't work at all, and she's trained herself to hear vibrations with all of her body through her bones, muscles, skin, and so forth. Hearing is a very intimate sense because sound is actually touching us deep inside our head It's actually physical touch. And that then is translated, of course, into an electrochemical stage, in which case, in which part this is turned into electricity in the brains, neurons fire off, and there's electrical activity going on. Now, I would suggest those two stages really are hearing. That's the first part of listening. Hearing is what you're all here because of, and it can be a real issue if that part of the process isn't working fully. The third part of the process is one which I think you probably are special forces at, which is the mental side, and that's where listening really takes place. The mental part of the process uses a lot of very interesting tricks. We've become very good at extracting information, making meaning from sound, for example, with pattern recognition. If you go to a party where it sounds like this, and I was just doing it out there before we came in here, the challenge is to extract the signal from the noise. And we do that by recognizing patterns. For example, if I said your name in that noise, you'd hear it immediately. Now, pattern recognition becomes more difficult as we get older. I don't like going to parties like that anymore. I find it harder and harder. It's a phenomenon you're probably all aware of called the cocktail party effect. It's hard to extract signal from noise as you get older. Secondly, we have differencing. If I put this sound on, you may be able to hear that. It's pink noise. If I left that on for 5 minutes or so, you would cease to hear it. Literally, because once our brains habituate to a constant sound, we discard it. We say, I don't need to listen to that anymore. I know what that's doing. I'm not going to pay attention. And we actually physically cease to hear it. That's differencing. And then we have the filters. Now, listening has got a huge range of filters in play. And most people are not conscious of the fact that they are listening through filters. Let me just list the filters to you. The culture that we come from. For example, I love the Finns. The Finns have a great relationship with silence, as you probably know. Many of my Finnish friends, their idea of a good night out is to go around to somebody's house, sit in silence for 3 hours, and then go home. They're a very taciturn people. Culture has a big effect on the way we listen to the world, on that filter. So does language. Some of the sub-Saharan languages, for example, indicate time, past, present, and future, not with words, but with inflection. So language can be a filter too. And then your values and your beliefs and your attitudes all shape whether you hear something, whether you actually take it in and listen to it or not, whether it's filtered out and you just don't receive it. Very often, this is the case with a partner or somebody that we live with very much. Expectations come into it too, and we develop a listening for that person where we simply don't hear the bits that don't conform to our listening, and we hear the bits that do, which are evidence that they're still like that, and we fix them. When I met my wife, I made a promise to her, which is, my promise is that I will listen to her every day as if for the first time. Now, I don't always succeed in that, but it's a great mission. It's a great intention. And intention is the last of the filters there. Our intention going into a situation changes what we hear, what we take in. So the filters are very important, and what's most important about the filters is to be conscious of them. Because by being conscious of them, we can play with them and understand that we're not necessarily hearing everything. Now, there is a problem, as I've said, which is that most people simply don't listen. You are, as I've said, really a special case because you listen hard. You have to. Most people simply don't listen to the world at all. Why is this? Well, first of all, we invented ways of recording what goes on. A long time ago, if you didn't listen and you missed it, you missed it. Well, now we can write it down. We can record it. I've written a book, so if you want to go to sleep right now, fine, you can go and buy my book. It's got the same stuff in it. So that kind of recording and encapsulating of information means that the premium on listening has reduced. But there are other reasons as well. We've become impatient as a society. We don't want oratory, we want sound bites. We don't listen to albums anymore, we listen to tracks. And in fact, my children, not even whole tracks, generally. People don't watch television, they channel hop. Our communication gets briefer and briefer. There is an argument that the internet is not connecting us, but in some ways disconnecting us. So this text message is all too common in the UK. And I'm not sure that's a very connected way for human beings to communicate with each other. And then, as well as our impatience and that speed that we're getting into, we also have a desensitization going on. Our media have to shout and scream at us to get our attention. And with all of this high emotion, this intensity, it means that the quiet and the subtle starts to get missed. There's a societal, a cultural issue here, which I think is well portrayed. If I remind you of the Chinese duality of yin and yang, where yin is dark, yielding, feminine, moon, cold, those kind of concepts, whereas the yang is heat, male, outgoing, sun, and so forth. Well, if I replace those two with sound words, I think you might agree with me that our culture has become far more interested in telling than in listening. We've become very pushy. And the result of that is that we have a world that looks like this and sounds like this. Incessant voices speaking to us the whole time from all sorts of different sources. Which brings me on to the subject of noise. Noise is becoming a very, very, very serious problem indeed. I'm going to give you some numbers and see if you can guess what these are. 1 in 4 Europeans is having their quality of life seriously reduced by noise. This is from the European Union. 4 million. That's the number of people in Europe who are having their sleep seriously disturbed by noise at night. 4 million people. Just imagine the cost of that to them, to their families, to the people they work with. It's 2% of Europe's population. 1 million years. This number just came out last week from the World Health Organization, and they've released a major study of noise in Europe. And they estimate that at a minimum, Europeans are losing 1 million healthy years every year to noise. It's become the second most significant health problem in Europe. And here's another one, tens of billions. Well, that's what the European Union estimates the cost of noise is to Europe in terms of reduced property prices, but also in terms of the cost of healthcare for people who are depressed, stressed, or suffering from ischemic heart disease, stroke, gastric problems, sexual dysfunction, all sorts of emotional and mental problems as a result of noise. It's a serious problem. The culprits are well known, transport, construction industry, and then all of us. The issue is that those sources are multiplied by an environment which is badly designed. Now, this is where we need to start engaging town planners and architects in the conversation. And I'm really excited that the HRF is starting to think in that way about aggressively taking on the mission of improving our sound environment. Because if we change the environment, instead of that multiplier, what we have is a dividing sign. We have noise going in and being reduced by an environment instead of noise going in and being amplified by an environment. Acoustics, very, very important. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. Education. So you may have a noise source like this. This is a very young noise source, but nevertheless, not atypical for a school situation. Put that into an old-fashioned school building with lousy acoustics, lots of reverberation, not much absorbency, and you have massive health problems for teachers. There's a recent piece of work by Gerhard Sissler which has shown that teachers have got their life expectancy reduced by 3 years. 3 years of life they lose as a result of the chronic stress of that kind of noise day after day after day. They develop vocal nodes because they have to shout so hard to get over the top of the noise. And they're not the only people losing, because for those children, if you have a classroom where the children at the back are experiencing speech intelligibility of, say, 0.5, which is not uncommon, that means they're only getting 5 words in 10, the teacher says. That means they don't even receive half their education. What chance have they got? Education? Serious. Healthcare. How does anybody get well in a soundscape like this? I spent quite a lot of time in an intensive care unit when my father was dying a few years ago now. And it was just miserable to be in rooms where that was the soundscape. It's been proven over and over again now that sound can speed up recovery, can actually enhance people's recovery and get them well from things they weren't getting well from before. Certainly it can reduce hospital stays, speed people through, and it reduces the stress for the people working in the hospital. The noise level in hospitals, according to American research, is double what it was in the 1970s. Serious. With all that going on, it's no surprise we take defensive measures. When you were little, if you didn't want to hear something, you could stick your fingers in your ears and hum. Well, these days people do that, but it looks a bit cooler. So this is the defense mechanism that most people have adopted to get away from the noise that's trying to intrude on them. The trouble is there are some really big effects of that as well. And the biggest one is this. Noise-induced hearing loss. 1 in 6 American teenagers has got damaged hearing as a result of headphone abuse. 1 in 6. We may be raising an entire generation of deaf children because the health risks of constant exposure to 90 or 100 decibels delivered deep inside the ear are really not known by children. I saw one tragic newspaper article where a girl was quoted as saying, "I'm sure my ears will adapt to it, though." Well, you know that's not true. It's tragic. Anytime I go on a tube and I can hear that leakage coming out of somebody's ears, I know they're damaging their hearing. It's a very major problem. Not the only problem with headphone abuse. This phenomenon is an interesting one. The word was coined by Murray Schafer. Schizophrenia is a disconnect between what I see and what I hear. So there's a dislocation. It removes me from the real world if I'm walking around with something different in my ears, which has got nothing to do with what I'm looking at. And there's another effect of that as well. We take a big public space, like a train station or a hall or a room like this, and very often we are turning it now into this. Millions of little personal sound bubbles. And in that situation, nobody's listening to anybody. There's no listening going on apart from my own little personal sound bubble. And that may be a contributor to a modern phenomenon which I've just blogged about with great relish. This word has come out in the last year or two in the UK, sodcasting. I don't know if you've come across the word. It's typically applied to the group of teenagers at the back of a bus playing music on a mobile phone through a lousy loudspeaker and upsetting everybody around them by polluting the environment with their sound. So it really means the unkind creation of noise, upsetting people, clearly upsetting people and not being thoughtful. They're not the only people doing sodcasting. I was in an airport lounge last week and I was subjected to some white-collar sodcasting. There were about 30 people in this airport lounge quietly working away. It was a very serene environment. And there was one man on the phone who obviously thought he had to speak loud enough to be heard in the UK from Germany without the aid of the device. Yeah, well, what they've got to do is this. And we're all sitting trying to work with this one person polluting the entire room. That's sodcasting. And so is mechanical sodcasting, leaf blowers, devices like that. There's a piece of work I quote in my book which estimates that one noisy scooter driving through the streets of Paris at 2 a.m. will wake up 250,000 people. That's powerful sodcasting. And then there's institutional sodcasting. In London, they play classical music in the tube stations now because they found it reduces vandalism. So we're all having it imposed on us. Commercial sodcasting, music in shops, and it goes on and on. The thoughtless imposition of sound on other people. Just a word on music while I'm on the subject, actually. Music is very powerful, and I spend a lot of my time talking to organizations and trying to persuade them not to play music in public places. Music is something we recognize fast and we associate with things very quickly. I'll just give you one example. Many of you will recognize that. If I talk to young audiences these days, I get a blank look for that chord. But many of you will have recognized the first chord of Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. Or you certainly will associate this with something. Now that's 1 second of music. It's very powerful. And the thing about music is that it has a specific intent. I don't know much music that was made, carefully made in a recording studio by people who made it in order not to be listened to. So there's a clash. If we play music as oral wallpaper, it's not fit for purpose. The music is shouting, "Listen to me," and we're pretending it's background. That's a mismatch. That's why music is incorrect. What we do, and here's a good example, for places like an airport where we were given the job of reducing stress levels in Glasgow Airport, is we create a generative soundscape. So you may be able to hear this, got a bit of birdsong, soothing, safety, very slow moving musical elements which are designed to be calming, very, very slow tempo, so it's in training people down. The effect was it reduced stress levels in that airport considerably, and the airport were very happy because sales in the shops went up. I guess because people were feeling a bit chilled out and didn't have to rush so much. So it is possible to create soundscapes, not music, but soundscapes which are like oral wallpaper. Okay, let me just go back to listening then. I just want to close this conversation about listening because it's so important that we are losing our listening. And that is not insignificant because listening is the doorway to understanding. And if we don't listen, then we're on the way to violence because not understanding people allows us to dehumanize people, and it creates conflict, judgment, prejudice, bias. All of those things are made possible if we don't listen. I, for one, am very concerned by a society where listening is becoming rarer and rarer because it puts us on a road which we don't want to be on. I'll just give you some exercises which I speak about to everybody about listening. You may well do some of these already. I'm going to go through them very quickly because I'm aware of time. Silence is the first. Silence is so rare these days. Just a few minutes of silence every day recalibrates, like a sorbet in a meal, resets the ears and allows us to have a context. All sound comes out of silence. The second one is an exercise I call the mixing desk, where we can sit in a place like a cafe with sound like this and just think about how many different channels of sound am I listening to. It's a very good exercise for developing listening skills. And it can be done in a beautiful place as well, like a lake, where I can start to say, well, how many birds can I hear? How many ripples? The third exercise is savoring. And this is a funny one. Most people consider this to be slightly strange, but I love it. I mean, for example, this is the sound of my tumble dryer, which I recorded before I came here. That's a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I could put that under a piece of music. It'd be quite groovy. So I get into listening carefully to even mundane sounds like this, or here's another one. There's glory in a kettle boiling. It's the hidden choir in the world around us, and it's good fun to do. Listening positions I'm not even going to go into here. I don't have the time, and it's too deep a subject, but just to say that we don't just listen from one place. There are so many different places we can listen from, and it's fun if you start to play with that. Like the caring professions know about active listening, where you reflect back to somebody. Or there's passive listening, where you just listen. Or what you're doing now, critical listening. Do I agree? Is he saying something interesting? Is this rubbish? That kind of voice going on all the time. So listening positions. And finally, a very important little acronym for anybody who's engaged in communication. This is about listening to people. The acronym is RASA. RASA is the Sanskrit word for juice. And I think it's quite a good acronym to use for this simple little listening technique. Receive, that's it, eye contact, paying attention, being open, pointing at the person. Appreciate, really, oh, little noises like that. Especially on the phone. I'm not very good at this on the phone. People sometimes say to me, are you still there? So little noises, keep it flowing. Summarize, the word so, wonderfully important in good listening. So, what you said is this. So, I hear this. So, does that mean this? And then finally asking questions. So what happened next? Do you mean this? That all engages. That's good listening practice. We need to teach that. I want to finish just by talking for a moment about the ontology of listening, because it's important, and you are listening specialists. Have you ever thought listening places us in the world? Places us in space, because we listen to a room like this, and we can hear tiny, tiny little sounds that tell us how big the room is, where the walls are. There's a blind guy in America who can ride a bike perfectly well using sonar. He's listening to the reflections of his clicking, and he doesn't bump into things. So it's a human skill that we all possess, places us in space. You can hear the little noises of people around you, but it also places us in time. I would suggest that sound is the main way we experience time. There's always time embedded in sound. There's no such thing as a sonic photograph. A moment of sound is meaningless. Hermann Hesse calls music time made aesthetically perceptible. So time, space, listening places us in the world, in the physical world, and in the spiritual world as well, because most people don't see God or whatever that means for you. It's normally heard. And it places us in the world with other people as we listen to each other and connect. I live to listen, it's my job. But what I hope we can achieve, and with your campaign, I really, really feel optimistic that this is a big step towards this, is helping people to listen, to live. It's like turning up the color on a television set. When you start to listen consciously, the world is a much richer and more beautiful place. So, just finish with some things to do. And this is things to do for all of us as human beings. Listening consciously. Crucial. The second one is taking responsibility for the sound that we make. Now that follows from the first. If we start to listen consciously, then we don't sodcast, because we're aware of the effect we're having on other people. So becoming conscious of our sound output. And complaining, incidentally, if you're in a loud place, complain. And you probably do that. Most people don't. Let's rediscover silence together. Let's get it into schools and universities and homes. Silence is golden, just a little bit every day. We need to start honoring music and not using it as some sort of veneer, some sort of disposable wallpaper. It's not that. It deserves to be treated better than that. Designing with sound, making soundscapes at home, in offices, in factories, in shops, and designing for sound. This is where we need to engage with those town planners and those architects who all too often don't think about the sound of the things they're making. They make a thing that looks great, and then we have to go and live in it. So designing for sound as well. And most of all, we need to teach our children these things. I want to see listening taught in schools. That is the antidote to all of this. And then we bring up a generation of people who are really listening to the world and going, well, why does that sound like that? We're not going to put up with that, and things will start to change. If we start to become conscious in our listening, we then become conscious in our creating. That is the way to achieve sound living as a civilization. I want to thank you very much for your attention, and for anybody who wants to connect with me afterwards, I really am sorry, but I can only stay for half an hour and then I've got to go to the airport and catch a plane. Happy to take any conversations, and there's some ways that you can connect with me afterwards, and I'm going to leave you with a bit more birdsong. Thank you very much.